Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 19 of Series 8. The question for today is, can a graduated conception of consciousness resolve philosophical problems? My underlying question, so the reading, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 6, Section 7. So my underlying question is again, what can we do with our lives or human existence as consciousness? So this isn't a question about ordinary questions of life or even about ethical action. It's about asking, what kind of thing is consciousness and what can we do with this kind of thing? So in this series, I'm posing questions about consciousness and proposing answers in terms of value. My hypothesis advocates an affirmation or will to value leading to a sufficiency of value. So now I'd like to hear better alternatives such as religion, existentialism, ethics, or anything else you can think of. But at the moment I'm explicating consciousness as a foundation for the above principle of value. And I've been doing that from a phenomenological perspective involving structures of consciousness. That is, structures like intentionality, temporality, divisibility, ephemerality, and graduation. In recent weeks, we have shown how graduation provides ways of understanding both mathematics and value. In other workshops, graduation provided a continuous explanation of mind without breaks or gaps. Today we are discussing graduation both generally and as a structure of consciousness. And as we will see, the graduation of consciousness is a much more contentious idea than we might think. Firstly, comprehending a graduated conception of consciousness requires understanding what consciousness is. But understanding consciousness is itself a difficult problem that we have discussed elsewhere. Secondly, there are different aspects of a graduated conception of consciousness that we must discuss in turn. And despite the evolution of species and individual development, a graduated consciousness is contended. Graduation of mental states like happiness or belief is more widely accepted. But graduations of some states like free will is rejected by Sartre and others. And graduation is also contentious in ethics and morals. We will also need to look at graduation in reason and logic. To sum up, we need to look at the concept of graduation as it applies to the different spheres of consciousness, mental states, free will, ethics and morals, and reason and logic. Yet I'm particularly concerned how graduation applies to consciousness or mind in general. However, graduation is also applicable to different schools of thought and as a way of thinking. On one side, there's a dogmatic, often science-based, black or white view that seeks certainty. On the other, we have graduation and humanistic perspectives that usually seek probability. Questions here aren't typically either or, but to what extent or to what degree. So questions of graduation are often decided by supposition or inclination rather than by argument. Yet I want to start by discussing the relatively uncontentious question of graduated mental states. These mental states include all kinds such as cognitive and non-cognitive states, like pain or pleasure, happiness, perception, belief and knowledge. It hardly needs to be proven that we can have degrees of such states like happiness and belief. The lover, for example, might ask his beloved, "How much do you love me?" And a religious person can ask about the strength of someone's faith. Yet the Oxford philosopher Henry Price reminded us that Locke regarded it as natural to suppose that a mental capacity is either completely actualized or completely latent, unquote. But Price corrected this seemingly idiosyncratic view by saying that it is an important fact about powers or capacities that they can be actualized in different degrees. And the need to make this point shows that it hasn't been well understood. Yet graduation of mental states is also hailed by others such as Darwin, Jean Piaget and Bernard Williams. Darwin wrote, "Psychology will be based on a new foundation, that of the necessary acquirement of each mental power and capacity by graduation," unquote. Yet some contention enters the issue with states such as free will, knowledge or logic. This view might be put forward, for example, in the case of knowledge that we either know or we don't know. But I first want to examine the question of degrees of free will, again, which is thought uncontentious. The question of degrees of free will can be first answered by empirical observation. We can see, for example, that animals, fetuses and the comatose certainly don't have free will. But reflective human consciousness has a capacity for what we might call free will. Social science reveals diminishing degrees of choice in the reasons why we do things. Self-observation also reveals that some of our actions are to be unconsciously motivated. And some thinkers like Merleau-Ponty, Julian Bagani and myself believe in degrees of free will. So on these accounts, complete or absolute free will is mistaken, as is complete or absolute determinism. This then is a strong case for degrees of free will. That is, if we can use the concept of free will at all. Yet Sartre oddly believes in this idea of complete and absolute free will. He writes that we are wholly and forever free or not free at all. Yet we must not only view Sartre's claim in the light of the evidence weighed against it, but also in light of his ultra-phenomenological understanding of consciousness that rejects the significance of the preconscious and the unconscious in a highly specialized conception of consciousness that we will question again shortly. From the question of graduated free will, we can naturally turn to the idea of graduation in ethics. Williams writes, many moral notions show a notable resistance to reflecting the scalar, that is, graduation. Such resistance is found in Descartes, Locke, Kant, Sartre, and in applications of logic to ethics. Resistance to graduation is also spurred by the idea of objective right and wrong and a rejection of relativity. But we must distinguish here between the material content of action and the formal content of principles. I think that the relativity of moral action is evident, yet I argue for a formal principle of value. And Derek Parfit also believes in moral and normative truths, but they are very imprecise or proximate. He says, for example, we ought to give to charity, but we can't determine exactly how much to give. And employing a graduated conception of mind, speaking on abortion, Parfit said that being a human being or a person shouldn't be regarded as all or nothing. Yet we can find ungraduated thinking throughout Kantian ethics, which led to intractable problems. In his metaphysics of morals, we find racist, sexist, and homophobic views based on rigid premises. He denies human rights to servants and slaves, enforcing runaways to return to work. And he also holds that we must never lie and that suicide is always wrong. Kant's ethics was, of course, influenced by logic and science, and he produced a moral law without exceptions. And the axioms of his categorical imperative were all aspects, he tells us, of the idea of universalization. But this ungraduated thinking in impartiality and objectivity also leads to the problem of moral distancing. That is, giving the same consideration to all under all circumstances, whether family, friends or strangers. The idea of objective rights also incurs irresolvable problems of conflicting rights. Yet a virtue theory of character and disposition would mitigate these problems. Kant's and other such thinking was influenced by thinking in science, reason and logic. And logical principles of excluded middle and its misapplication is fundamental to these problems. The excluded middle is an argument in logic that can be misapplied to minds or matter. The argument is that an item either exists or doesn't exist. It can't partially exist. For example, in logic, half a house or half a mind are both complete concepts. But in the non-logical world, half a house can be legitimately conceived as half a house. Similarly, half a mind can be legitimately described as such from the perspective of that mind. But there's a problem of justifying such a particular perspective, whether it's logical, material or mental. Yet personal identity legitimizes the perspective by which I can judge that half a mind is half a mind. My point is that the excluded middle can be illegitimately applied to mental and material items. We will see a misapplication of this to the graduation of consciousness shortly. Yet I would also like to note that the principle of excluded middle is an aspect of a certain kind of logic. Other kinds of logic exist, like modal logic and inductive logic, as well as deductive logic. There's a conditional logic of if this then that, or the deontic logic of ought, or temporal logic of always, or epistemic logic of it is known that. My point is that the principle of excluded middle can not only be misapplied to physical and conscious items, but that it represents one kind of logic and is one kind of thinking that needs to be applied carefully. But before discussing how graduated or ungraduated thinking applies to cognition and consciousness, we should briefly note at how they are relevant to the physical world and to science as noted above. Like logic and reason, the features of science are typically bivalent and ungraduated. Sciences employ positivistic ideals like precision, certainty, unambiguity and clarity. This has led many to consider how this kind of thinking influences both society and philosophy. Heidegger, for example, questioned the adverse effects of technology. Nietzsche criticized both the concept of truth and Socrates' rationalist thinking employed in science. Paul Feyerabend's infamous essay was entitled "How to Defend Society Against Science." Yet he explained himself by saying that he was criticizing the supposedly unique status of scientific truth and method. So we must consider the appropriateness of ungraduated black or white or all or nothing thinking in the humanities. A priori methods and necessary relations are the correct approaches for mathematics and logic. In the physical sciences, a posteriori methods and contingent discovery are also correct. Both these abstract and physical sciences still seek predictability, precision, certainty, clarity, and predictability. But it's questionable that these ideal ungraduated principles should be strictly applied in the humanities. Yet the methods of analytic philosophy are unashamedly taken from science. And like science, analytic philosophy isn't holistic, but understands by breaking things into parts. Its criteria of correctness are logical certainty and linguistic precision and clarity. These aren't graduated ideals of human life where everything is subject to degrees. Reason and logic are generally thought to be ungraduated, but the above examples throw doubt on that view. We earlier saw the example of either knowing or not knowing as illustrating this ungraduated view. But we can easily find degrees of knowledge, belief, doubt and faith that undermine that view. And I'm particularly interested in two applications of the graduation of cognition in relation to consciousness. Firstly, as a graduated cognitive framework used as a moral criterion in different degrees of support. Secondly, as a graduated cognitive framework that explains the mysteriousness of consciousness. I previously explained these two applications, but I will outline them again here. Firstly, the above case of moral fortitude or independence, where unwarranted cognitive support isn't desirable. I define moral fortitude as doing the right thing without or with limited social or cognitive support, and I describe this as attenuated cognition in its degrees of cognitive support or its absence. This is a different way of looking at moral judgments than traditional criteria, and examples of excessive moral support can be found in Bernard Williams' notion of self-indulgence. Sartre's spirit of seriousness decries using objective values as avoiding freedom and responsibility. And existentialists generally relish in inadequately informed choices as occasions of freedom and authenticity where they are asked to draw on their own inner resources. In the second case noted above, attenuated cognition can also explain the mysteriousness of consciousness. To start with, Freud, Russell and Wittgenstein described mysticism variously as a sense of oneness with the universe, interrelatedness, and feeling the world as a limited whole. Other mysterious objects are like God, being, the universe, flying saucers, and the totality of things. An explanation is found in this kind of perception produced by the limited background or background of understanding. Standard perception involves a contrast and reference to the background of understanding. But self-consciousness cannot compare itself to other objects of the same type in the same way. Attenuated cognition thereby explains mysteriousness in consciousness and other objects. But graduation of mind or consciousness is more contentious than of mental states, such as in the above attenuated cognition, free will, ethics, and in a limited applicability of in logic and science. And as noted, a case for the graduation of mind can be obtained from species evolution and a personal development. Firstly, different creatures exist and individuals develop with different levels of mind. Secondly, they all have minds. Thirdly, these are all different levels of mind, and therefore, fourthly, mental graduation is a fact. But the argument is more nuanced and contested than this indicates. Yet we should first note some strong positions in favour of a graduated conception of mind. Bernard Williams, for instance, rejects the all or nothing or ungraduated conception of mind. John Eccles speaks of progressive development of biological evolution of consciousness. Untypically, the Jesuit Teilhard de Chardin also speaks of degrees of consciousness. And it may be an argument for, rather than against, that Descartes doesn't consider the graduation of mind at all. Descartes' belief in souls, animals as automatons, and bivalent logic supports this interpretation. He characterizes mind by rationality, transparency, individuality, and non-extension in space. It's a first that Descartes attributes such features to mind, but I and others disagree with all four of these features. For example, although mind may not be extendable in space, it can be extended in its own way, that is, as graduation. But several modern thinkers, such as Sartre, Colin McGinn, and Tim Bain, oppose a graduated account of mind. Sartre holds it's impossible to conceive of consciousness to the degree to which it is not conscious of itself, unquote. But this can be challenged because consciousness can have a diminished awareness of its own existence. Human beings provide ample examples as well as experiments with chimpanzees. Yet, as noted last week, Sartre employs a highly specialized ultra-phenomenological conception of consciousness. And on that view, he can't accept a graduated or even preconscious or unconscious conceptions of consciousness. But it's doubtful that Sartre could be able to properly define consciousness in that way, or even if he could, whether graduation might apply even to ultra-phenomenological consciousness. And on that view, he can't accept a graduated or even preconscious or unconscious conceptions of consciousness. But it's doubtful that Sartre could be able to properly define consciousness in that way, or even if he could, whether graduation might apply even to ultra-phenomenological consciousness. Yet in Tim Bain's book on the subject, he rejects degrees of consciousness. One of the analogies that he gives to support this view is that people cannot be more alive or dead. But this is an unfortunate analogy, as science shows that death can't be exactly determined. Yet Colin McGinn agrees that one of the few things that we can say about consciousness is that it's not a matter of degree. He says that the emergence of consciousness must be compared to a sudden switching on of a light. But this is a telling metaphor of an electric light rather than the gradual changes of natural light at dawn, and this might thereby be rejected as just another illustrative metaphor. But McGinn goes further and says that the concept of consciousness doesn't allow borderline cases of sentience, and that either a creature definitely is conscious or it is definitely not. But examples of borderline consciousness can be found in insect mollusks, sponges, and jellyfish. Therefore, McGinn's case against graduated consciousness seems to flounder. Yet the certainty with which graduation is rejected and the arguments for it motivate me to find greater nuances. In this, we can make distinctions between mind, consciousness, awareness, and the fact of their existence. One such argument against graduated consciousness is that self-consciousness is simply the recognition of the fact of consciousness. And on this view, the fact of the matter is subject to binary existence of the principle of excluded middle. But the fact of the existence of consciousness should not be confused with the capacities which can be graduated. And on this distinction, the logical status of fact must be differentiated from the perception of a fact. And again, we can have different degrees of perception or awareness of this fact. Yet on this more detailed account, we need the distinctions between mind, consciousness, and awareness. Mind can be defined as a general concept, including animals and insects that need not be conscious. Following John Searle, consciousness is an amalgam of all those states that we are conscious of. And in my view, awareness is a particular focus of consciousness. If we're talking about mind, the case seems to be undeniable for graduations from insects to animals and humans. With respect to consciousness, pre-reflective animal consciousness graduates to reflective human consciousness, and humans have distinctive capacities of abstraction, morals, and personal identity. A basic argument for this view can be drawn from Jean Piaget's graduations of personal development. From 0 to 2 years is an age of exploration. From 2 to 7, language and symbols are used, but egocentrically. From 7 to 11, the child is able to employ abstract and logical notions. From 11 to 15, we find hypothetical ideas and the development of a conception of other minds. But Piaget tells us that some of these capacities are not reached by many adults. But a criticism of this argument is that they are only particular capacities or skills, not a development of mind. Yet it's reasonable that these capacities are products of general levels of consciousness. Moreover, Piaget's view of children can be continued for adults with Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and these needs can be said to reflect levels of awareness. His scale of needs is 1. Physiological, 2. Safety, 3. Love and friendship, 4. Self-respect and self-esteem, and 5. Self-actualization, becoming oneself and fulfilling potential, attained by only 2% of humanity. So both Piaget and Maslow have a dim view of actual human attainment. Yet degrees of consciousness in adults is more elusive than different levels of skill or intelligence. But Maslow's hierarchy of needs also reflects awareness of needs as well as actual needs, and awareness of such needs are particular focal points of consciousness. Also, if consciousness is an amalgam of our different mental states, as modern thinking shows, then different levels of awareness or skills is another argument for graduations of consciousness. But I also want to consider awareness as a way of understanding the argument against graduated consciousness. That is, we have consciousness, and as humans we also have reflective consciousness. Yet as thoughtful humans or philosophers, we also have an awareness of reflective consciousness. That is, we are conscious or aware of the fact that we have reflective consciousness. And in trying to appreciate the argument against a graduated consciousness, I'm drawn to considering that it is one of these levels that is being rejected. But in the end, I find it more plausible that consciousness has just not been understood. I have, of course, argued extensively for the graduation of consciousness elsewhere, and that is my conclusion here. In this workshop, I've been applying graduation as a structure of consciousness to several states and activities. These included cognitive and non-cognitive states like happiness and belief, as well as applying it to other states like free will, ethics, reason, knowledge, and science. We previously also used the idea of graduation in explanations of value and mathematics. Elsewhere, I show how graduation explains how mind emerges from matter without discontinuities or gaps. That is, we need to explain the emergence of mind from matter without ontological or theoretical gaps. For continuity, we need a concept of graduation to explain changes naturally and continuously. I will be doing this again in a couple of weeks. Yet I also have a particular interest in graduation in an application that I called attenuated cognition. This helped to explain both morals in a limited cognitive framework of support and in mysteriousness as a feature of consciousness which lacks a background of understanding. Yet I am most interested in the graduation of mind or consciousness as a whole, and we found that despite evolutionary and personal evidence, this idea was strongly contested. One way of understanding this reticence is simply to acknowledge the neglect of consciousness. Yet to appreciate the argument against graduation, we noted distinctions between mind, consciousness, and awareness. The graduation of mind in evolutionary development were difficult to contest, but distinctions between consciousness, reflective consciousness, awareness of reflective consciousness, and the fact of consciousness reveal how confusion and mistakes could happen. Yet the probability of confusion, mistakes, and neglect of consciousness is greater than the probability of a graduated conception of mind or consciousness being mistaken. So let me have your comments and criticisms at the meeting or on websites like Zoom or meetup.com.